Unit 12.2, Part 2. Dr. David Livingstone and H.M. Stanley. Dr. David Livingstone was a Scottish missionary who went into the African continent, into the Congo, to do what Rudyard Kipling and Herbert Spencer offered as the solution to the African problem or to the world's problem, and tried to modernize backward societies. H.M. Stanley was sent in to rescue him. We'll see more of H.M. Stanley soon. J.A. Hobson and Imperialism and Lenin, Imperialism, the highest stage of world capitalism, are together. The large surpluses of capital that bankers and industrialists were accumulating often encouraged them to seek higher rates of profit in underdeveloped areas. All of these factors combined to create economic imperialism, whereby European finance dominated the economic activity of a large part of the world. This analysis was put forward by critics like the English socialist J.A. Hobson, who wrote Imperialism in 1903, and later by Lenin in his Imperialism, the highest stage of world capitalism, written in 1916. They ascribed imperialism primarily to the accumulation of surplus capital and condemned it on socialist grounds. The British Empire. In the early 19th century, the British controlled the most extensive empire in human history. Although they did not actively look to expand during these years, the British consolidated their existing possessions. In the Western Hemisphere, the British ruled a number of islands in the Caribbean: British Honduras, which is Belize; in Central America, British Guiana, which is Guyana; and in South America, until 1867, Canada. The Sepoy Mutiny and Rebellion. In Asia, the crown jewel of the British Empire was India. The British had received India from France in the Seven Years' War in the 18th century, but was only administered on a strictly commercial level. In 1857, the British faced a dangerous rebellion known as the Sepoy Mutiny. The Sepoys were soldiers within the Indian Army controlled by the British, and really was the only organization which Indians could exert any collective pressure. The Sepoys mutinied in the Ganges Valley, and the British reprisal was brutal. Still, the uprising persuaded the British to radically new course of policy, pursued basically until the end of the British Empire a century later. India would now be ruled directly by the British government. The British in South Africa. This new age of imperialism, the British were by far the most active in Africa. Its African possessions were relatively meager prior to this. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had acquired the Cape of Good Hope at the tip of the South African coast. The Boers and Afrikaners. As British settlers and the merchants moved into the Cape Colony, friction soon developed between the British and the Boers, descendants of Dutch colonists who had been there for over 200 years. The Boers eventually began to move north away from the Cape Colony to the interior of South Africa, forming two separate republics, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal in the late 1830s. Skipping over Orange Free State and Transvaal, we're going to talk about Cecil Rhodes. But the conflict was just starting in South Africa, especially after the arrival of Cecil Rhodes. He was an English businessman. He had made a fortune in diamond, De Beers, which had been discovered in South Africa in 1869. Rhodes began preaching a dream of a belt of British African possessions that stretched from the Cape to Cairo. Immediately, the British began to push north. Making matters worse, in 1886, gold was discovered in the Boer-controlled Transvaal. As prospectors began to flood into the Transvaal, tensions once again mounted between the British and the Boers. Dr. Leander Jameson and the Jameson Raid. The Jameson Raid convinced the leadership of the Transvaal that Cecil Rhodes was plotting to take over the Transvaal and its sister Boer Republic, the Orange Free State. Eventually, this transgresses into a full-scale war in 1899 known as the Boer War. Although the Transvaal and the Orange Free State put up a determined resistance, the war ended with a British victory in 1902. The Kruger Telegram. Know that the Kruger Telegram was a direct slap in the face to the British. German industry was beginning to catch up with British industry, but it was the building of the German Navy that would press the British into action. British sea power had been unchallenged for more than 2 centuries. The Suez Canal crisis. The British had also been busy in northern Africa. In 1875, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli bought 44% of the shares of the Suez Canal Company from the Egyptian Khedive. The purchase was extremely important for the British in that the French constructed Suez Canal was a link between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. Although technically a part of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt was an independent state. The Khedive had accumulated an enormous debt, borrowing heavily from European bankers who demanded repayment. This sale of the Suez Canal shares provided only temporary relief, and by 1879 the British and French governments had established joint control over Egypt's finances. In 1882, the British established a protectorate over Egypt, eliminating the French from Egyptian affairs. Siege of Khartoum and Charles Gordon. The Siege of Khartoum, which was the capital of the Sudan, the Siege of Khartoum was the siege of the capital of Sudan. The city, which was defended by Egyptian garrison under the British general Charles George Gordon, was captured, and its defenders, including Gordon, were slaughtered. The attack caused a storm of public protest against the alleged inaction of the British government. The Battle of Omdurman. In 1882, the British established a protectorate over Egypt, eliminating the French from Egyptian affairs. The tension that was rising between the French and British in Egypt almost boiled over in the Sudan. The Sudan, located to the south of Egypt, became an object of British and French colonial desire. In 1884, a joint British-Egyptian force marched up, which means down, the Nile River into the Sudan, and after a 10-month siege was massacred by the Sudanese in 1885. So, in 1898, a small British-Egyptian force commanded by Lord Kitchener exacted revenge at the bloody Battle of Omdurman. The Fashoda Crisis. A few days later, at Fashoda on the Nile, Kitchener encountered a French force under the command of Major Marchand, who had moved into the Sudan from French possessions in West Africa. During the ensuing Fashoda crisis, war looked to be certain between France and Britain. Cooler heads eventually prevailed when the French decided to yield to Britain and move out of the Sudan. French imperialism in Africa. With with the French in Africa, they began to work as early as 1830. It is in 1830 that the French began the process of acquiring Algeria and North Africa, which they ruled directly by the 1870s. In the late 19th century, the French succeeded in creating a huge empire in Africa. In North Africa, the French moved into Tunisia in 1881 and Morocco shortly after. In addition, the French developed a number of colonies in the French Equatorial Africa and French West Africa. Major French West African colonies included Senegal, Guinea, and Côte d'Ivoire. France also acquired the large island of Madagascar off Africa's east coast, as well as French Somaliland on the Red Sea. Belgian imperialism in Africa and Leopold II of Belgium. Another interesting imperial development was that of Belgium. When Dr. David Livingstone was presumed lost or dead after disappearing deep into the Congo, H.M. Stanley, a British journalist, was sent to track him down. Although he did find him, Stanley returns with stories of the wealth of the Congo region, which was deemed too dense and dark by most Europeans. King Leopold II of Belgium, acting as a private individual rather than a king, personally employed Stanley to represent him in signing treaties with African chieftains in the Congo region. Eventually, the Congo Free State was founded under the personal rule of Leopold II. The Congo became notorious for Leopold's use of forced labor in the production of rubber, ivory, and minerals. As international protests intensified, the Belgian government finally assumed control of the Congo in 1908. German imperialism in Africa. Otto von Bismarck, Germany's chancellor, had little interest in the imperial expansion in Africa, believing that the newly united Germany should devote its attention to the domestic and European matters. Bismarck eventually was forced to give way in the face of demands of the Junkers class, the aristocracy, the higher class, who stated the loss of German prestige by not showing its power. In 1884, Germany acquired Togoland, Togo, and the Cameroons, Cameroon, as well as German Southwest Africa, Namibia. In 1885, Germany established its control over German East Africa, Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania. Portuguese imperialism in Africa. The Portuguese expanded their old coastal trading stations into full-fledged colonies of Portuguese Guinea and Angola in West Africa and Mozambique in East Africa. Spanish imperialism in Africa. Spanish holdings included Rio de Oro, Western Sahara, and Spanish Guinea, Equatorial Guinea, in Western Africa. In the early years of 1900s, in the 1900s, Spain established a protectorate over Spanish Morocco. Manchu China. In the early 19th century, China was slowly falling apart. Led by the Manchu dynasty, it had fallen into a deep-rooted decay, which was intensified by the Europeans trying to move in on Chinese natural resource wealth. Though Europeans wanted Chinese products, the Chinese had no interest in buying European products in return. The Opium Wars. Trade, therefore, was difficult, and the British East India Company had for decades solved the problem of getting Chinese tea for Europe by shipping Indian-grown opium in return, and the Chinese demand for opium was very high. When the Chinese government attempted to control the inflow of opium, the British government went too far to war, which was dangerous for the Chinese. At the conclusion of the First Opium War in 1842, the British annexed Hong Kong and compelled the Chinese to open 5 ports, including Shanghai and Canton, for foreign trade. In 1857, Britain, along with France, went to war with China over the shipping of opium, and in 1858, China was forced to open 11 additional ports. The Taiping Rebellion. Radical political and religious upheaval. The Taiping Rebellion was radical political and religious upheaval that was probably the most important event in China in the 19th century. It lasted for some 14 years, 1850 to 1864, ravaged 17 provinces, and took an estimated 20 million lives, irrevocably altering the Qing dynasty. Europeans in China. At the conclusion of the First Opium War in 1842, the British annexed Hong Kong. In 1857, Britain, along with France, went to war again with China over the shipping of opium, and in 1858, China was forced to open those 11 additional ports. In these 16 cities, Europeans were allowed to make settlements of their own, immune to all Chinese law. Europeans traveling in China remained subject only to their own governments, and European and American gunboats began to patrol the Yangtze River. The British and French in Southeast Asia. Thus, China and Southeast Asia began to be carved up by Europe and the United States. The French annexed French Indochina, which was Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, in 1883, while the British annexed Burma in 1886. A buffer state was created between their holdings in the independent kingdom of Siam, which is Thailand. The Boxer Rebellion. Intensifying anti-foreign feeling in China resulted in the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. Some 200 foreign missionaries and other civilians were killed, and in the summer of 1900, foreign embassies in Peking were besieged. As a result, an international expeditionary force of Europeans and Americans were dispatched to China and brutally put down the revolt. Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States. In 1854, the United States Navy, under Commodore Matthew Perry, compelled the Japanese to open up their ports to outside trade. What resulted was a shockingly quick modernization in government, economy, and the Japanese military. Eventually, Japanese imperialism came into conflict with China.